performance training 2, day 2. On day 2 of high performance training 2, we're going to talk about intensity. On day 1, we talked about volume, and as a review, volume typically is the amount that you've been training, and you can measure it in minutes or you can measure it in time. Time and minutes are kind of the same thing. A quick example would be an hour and a half practice would be less volume of training than a 2-hour practice. So you're using the amount of time that you're actually physically doing the exercises to measure volume. Now, volume and intensity kind of go hand in hand. And again, just as a review, one of the principles or fundamental ideas of periodization, volume, intensity, recovery, peaking, tapering is to keep athletes performing at the highest level so that they are properly overreached, properly peaked, recovered, and then ready to go for their events. Now, getting back to the definition, or my definition of intensity as their quick definition is how hard you're actually working, because hard or how hard is a very subjective term. We'll give you some more information or examples so that it can make more sense. On day 1, we talked about volume and the different ways that you can increase and decrease the volume, and today we'll do the same thing with intensity. But if you remember on day 1 with volume, we suggested that the volume could be measured in the amount of time that you were wrestling live, as an example, and the intensity of live wrestling versus drilling is the difference between how hard they would be. Another example would be technique. When you're doing a technique session, typically in wrestling, if you start practice, you'll have a warm-up, maybe they'll stretch, maybe they'll take a little recovery break, and then the coach or the teacher will start to teach technique. In the beginning of the season and in the beginning of learning a new skill, the intensity of the drilling is low. Maybe, again, I use examples with numbers because sometimes they're easier to understand. If wrestling live or wrestling a match, competition match is 10, learning technique and drilling that technique right after you learned it is typically around the 1 or a 2 in terms of intensity, in terms of how hard they're actually going through the movements and how fast in the amount of power that they're applying. Does that make sense? So can you understand and see the difference between the intensities of learning a brand new skill, technical skill in wrestling, versus wrestling live actually in a match? A little more on that, and then we'll get back to the intensity. Prior to learning a brand new skill, your muscles, a lot of people like to use the term muscle memory, your muscles have not had enough experience in that particular movement to do it at a very fast pace. As a coach, I sort of suggest that to athletes, because if they've never done a skill and you maybe have watched them do it 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 times as a coach, you notice that there are a lot of mechanics and a lot of movements that they need some work on. So what I would typically do is tell them to slow down just a little bit, go step by step in the progression that we taught you so that you can learn how to do the move and then gradually pick up the speed, which also means gradually pick up the intensity of the movement. So again, intensity in this sense is the speed of the movement, the power that you're using with the movement, and how hard they're actually doing it. Again, so I'm trying to give you different examples so you can see how the intensity is measured, and we're going to give you some measurements here right now in this example. Yesterday, or on day 1 in volume, we also talked about strength and conditioning. And to me, as an aside, strength and conditioning simply means getting stronger in something and then continuing to do it. Now, I think training is strength and conditioning, in as much as whatever you're training, you can continue to do it and you can actually get better at it. And the conditioning portion is repetitiously doing it over the course of 3 to 6 to 9 to 12 months and ultimately macro cycle. Okay, so getting back to the example of strength and conditioning, running and or jogging, those are 2 different types of intensities. Sometimes people call running sprinting. Okay, so sprinting is typically running as fast as you possibly can, and that's one extreme of an intensity, and in this example they'd be to the right of the spectrum. And then jogging is typically what people would do when they're warming up prior to sprinting. If you ever go to a track and field competition, you'll notice they're doing all kind of warm-up exercises before they actually do their event, whether it's 100, 200, or any event really. They'll do some kind of low intensity type of jogging to gradually get their muscles and their minds ready. Ultimately, that's what the warm-up is for. By the way, the cool-down actually works in reverse, but we're talking about intensity and trying to give you different examples of it, and soon we're going to give you some measurements so that you can understand and use these and apply these so that you are properly trained versus being under-recovered versus being overtrained. Okay, so the example of running, it can also be used in swimming or any sport. Typically the movement patterns are much slower, the power is reduced, meaning the intensity is not as high, because when you're warming up, you're always going to gradually, kind of like warming up a car, gradually get your mind and body to a point where the muscles can move as fast as possible. So just giving you a bunch of different examples of how intensity can be used in examples so that you can quickly understand what intensity means. Now, how do we measure intensity, and what's the importance of it for under recovery and overtraining? Okay, so with the examples of intensity that I've given you, so you understand how the intensity can be increased or decreased. So here's an example, and I juxtapose, or I usually give the opposite so that you can quickly see, or give two examples so you can see the difference, and that's what I did with the warming up and versus the sprinting or maximum speed. And I guess another way to say it would be maximum versus minimum speed. Maximum power versus minimum power. Those would be different examples of to the left and to the right in terms of intensity. Okay, so here's how you can actually measure it. Yesterday, or on day one in volume, I gave you the example of wrestling in live minutes: 17 minutes, 19 minutes, 21 minutes. So now you're kind of combining two different types of terms, periodization terms. The volume would be increased 17, 19, 21 in terms of the actual minutes wrestled during that practice, and the intensity, or the volume of intensity, would actually be increased. Now, you wouldn't probably do this over the course of days, although you could. You might be doing it over the course of a mesocycle, which is a training month. 17 minutes 5 times a week, the next week. 19 minutes 5 times a week, maybe the next week if you're doing a 4-week mesocycle. 21 minutes 5 times a week, and then gradually you reduce it. Let's say if you go back to doing a 5-week microcycle, 3 building weeks and 4 building weeks and 1 recovery week. So that 5th week would be something like probably 17.5 or 17 if that was your first mesocycle. For your second mesocycle, maybe it would be 18. Anyhow, the idea there is we're manipulating the intensity to elicit or to get to a very well-trained athlete. Okay, so how could that go over the course of a macrocycle, which is a training year? You could use that type of model. Again, with volume and intensity, some of the information is very similar. We're typically never going to increase the intensity per training week more than 30%. So we're always going to stay within that 1% to 30% range. Now, there are occasions when you can go over that, but that is a specific overreaching type of design, and then the recovery would also have to be implemented so that the athletes would not be under-recovered nor overtrained. Getting back to the example of several mesocycles or a training year, how would we implement that type of intensity and get a very good response to peak the athlete or taper the athlete? Again, we're going to have different discussions just on recovery and peaking and tapering, but many of these terms are interrelated, meaning it's very difficult or almost impossible to give examples without using some of the other terms. However, you can go into depth on each specific topic so that one person can understand, and then gradually give more information on one area, gradually give more information. So ultimately, you as athlete, me as coach, or vice versa, we have a very good understanding of these concepts so that we can go out and become a high-performance training athlete and or coach. All right, so over the course of the year, you could use this type. Here's a quick example. So we did 17, 19, 21, 1, 2, 3 building weeks. 4th week is recovery. So we come back down. Let's say we go to 17, 17.5. The following week, we stair step. These are intensities in terms of minutes that we're talking about. 17, 19, 21. For the first 3 weeks, those are building weeks. The fourth week could be 17 or 17.5. All right. So the next training month would be 19. You start off the first week with the second week of the mesocycle in the first mesocycle. Does that make sense? Let me say it again. The second mesocycle, you start off with the second training week in terms of intensity. So the second microcycle and the first mesocycle. So I'll repeat it again because you may be confused. First mesocycle, 17, 19, 21. Fourth training week, we go back to 17 or 17.5. Second mesocycle, 19, 21, 23 in terms of intensity, right? Intensity of training, wrestling live minutes. And then the fourth mesocycle, we would come back to right around 19 or 19.5 because you started with that particular intensity in terms of volume of intensity. Third mesocycle, 21, 23, 25. And yesterday or day one, we gave an example of undulating. And so the fourth microcycle and the third mesocycle would likely be 21 or 21.5. So each time, if you go all the way back, you're gradually amping up the intensity. You're gradually increasing the intensity. You're gradually adding on. You're gradually overreaching the athletes. Okay, so that's a big important concept, gradual progression. So it's balanced training. On the other hand, if we increase the intensity of training too much, this is a lot of times where athletes actually can become hurt and or their body has not been able to adapt that quickly because they just weren't ready. Similar to a warm-up, your Russian roulette suggests that you can do anything you want to do and you never know what you're going to get, right? Kind of a crazy sort of scenario there. And here's an example of what I mean. You can do whatever you want in terms of training. You just don't know what you're going to get in terms of are they undertrained, are they overtrained, are the athletes ready, are they peaked, are they tapered. The idea behind measuring and periodization in general is you have a better indication of where the athletes are at. And the athletes actually can gradually start to feel better. They gradually get more confident, and after they understand a lot of these basic concepts, they can actually start to implement these training terms on their own, and they can do them with their teams, and now the team can become a much better group. Okay, so I gave you 3 mesocycles, and just quickly, if you can review or maybe perhaps listen to this again, the mesocycles we were talking about where we talked about 2 terms, volume and intensity, and we started off with intensity in live wrestling minutes at 17, first mesocycle, second mesocycle 19, third mesocycle 21. Each time the intensity of wrestling live minutes actually went up, and then there was a stair-step fashion where the undulating again means a wavy pattern, meaning it's going up and it's going down, it's always changing. And the concept of undulating that I would like for everyone to try to understand is it's actually 3 steps up, 1 step back, 3 steps up, 1 step back. If you're using 4 microcycles in a mesocycle or 4 training weeks inside your training month, at the USOEC or the United States Olympic Education Center, I did 3-week mesocycles, so 2 training building weeks up, 1 training building week back. I'll give you a quick example of that so you can see how that works too. 17, 19, 17 as an example. 17 minutes live, 19 minutes live, 17 minutes live. Next month, 19, 21, 19. 19 minutes live, 21 minutes live, 19 minutes live. Live wrestling. Third mesocycle. 21, 23, 21. So each time you undulate, each time you go up and then you come down again. This is gradual process of building up the athlete's fitness, which is also builds up their confidence, which also gives their body a chance to adapt. And that, again, that's a really important concept, gradual progression, so that you give the body a chance to adapt to the training. Here's, I guess I'm going to juxtapose it with an example that could increase too much. Now those 17 actually is a lot of, maybe I don't think you would start off a season with either one of those mesocycle examples with 17 minutes live wrestling, although you could. I think in yesterday's discussion or day one, I talked about 12 minutes live wrestling. However, for this example, let's say a coach or a team started off wrestling live at 17 minutes, and then the following week they increased it to 24 minutes, and then the following week they increased it to 30 minutes, and they just kept going until week 12, 13, 14, 15, they're actually wrestling, over half of the practice live. Maybe they're at 37, 38, 39 minutes of live wrestling. Okay, you can do that. Athletes can actually do that. You'd be amazed. Their bodies can withstand anything, but the challenge is, are they ready to compete in tournaments? Are they ready to actually have healthy bodies? Because although I just said that athletes probably can do just about anything, but their bodies actually start to break down, right? So the gradual progression of adding intensity over time allows the body to almost increase the homeostasis, which means their base level of fitness actually goes up. So what's normal to them in one mesocycle actually gradually goes up to normal in the next mesocycle, where if you increase it again over 30% intensity or over 30% volume of intensity per week, the body does not have enough time to adapt and adjust. And this is where you run into three ideas: overtraining, under recovery, and injuries. And the other concept could be just the athletes just aren't having fun. The athletes just are unable to, focus really on training because it's too intense, right? So the whole concept that we're talking about today is intensity, and now I'm giving you examples of how it can be too much or too little or just right. In the first two examples, I gave you balanced training and undulating training, which suggests that you start off with a number, and I'm going to just maybe throw this out there. 17 minutes probably likely would be like the third or fourth mesocycle inside of a wrestling program. 12 minutes starting off the season probably is accurate for most programs. In 12 minutes live, the first day of practice is probably going to be a lot. Now, keep in mind, this is an hour and a half or 2 hour practice, so I'm not suggesting that the whole practice is 12 minutes. I'm saying that we're measuring the volume of intensity and the intensity in live wrestling minutes. Another example that I gave in day one was, in the beginning of this discussion, is wrestling intensity in terms of drilling. Again, the amount of live wrestling that you do and the amount of, I'm going to call it 7, 8, 9 type of drilling, where the drilling is almost at competition speed, that is a very good measurement in terms of how hard or how intense the practice is. Because in a technical session where you're learning how to do the technique, it's not that, mentally, psychologically, there's a lot going on because the athletes have to actually process it. When you're doing fast drilling, competition speed drilling, not only do the athletes have to process the information much faster, they're actually physically going through the skills and they're using their bodies in a more powerful way. So it can become a much more intense practice. If you also add live wrestling to that, now can you see how a technical learning session, which is way less intense than a practice where you do a warm-up and then you do fast speed competition drilling and then you do live wrestling? So in those examples, you can see, those are two different types of practices. Also on day one, just as a review, so that you can see the different levels of intensities and how you would measure them and make certain that you're properly trained so that you can peak in for your competitions. We used a strength and conditioning example. In the beginning of this, we did too. And this time we'll use the weight room. Yesterday we used the weight room, or day one we used the weight room. Strength and conditioning in the weight room, the intensity is already high, typically, right? You typically don't do more than 70 repetitions of any exercise. In fact, most people never probably get to 70 unless they're doing some type of circuit training, and even then, it's not 70 of the same exercise. It's probably 30 of one, 30 of another, 20 of one. Anyhow, getting to the point, strength and conditioning is much more intense than a technical session in learning how to do the lift. Once you already know how to, and this is very similar in wrestling or any sport, once you know how to do the lift, now you can actually put on more weight, which is more intensity. When you put on more weight, now you do one set that would be the volume. 2 sets would be increasing the volume. 3 sets would be increasing the volume. If you put on more weight and you put on more volume, now you're adding 2 components, volume and intensity. I'm just illustrating how you can have intensity in different measures in different areas. Strength and conditioning, I gave you a swimming example earlier, and I gave you a track and field example earlier. The idea behind showing you and describing those to you is so you understand you gradually need to increase your intensity over weeks and months instead of going above that, what I like to call threshold of 30% per week. When you do that, your body is not properly recovered and does not have enough time to recover in between workouts, nor will it be ready for the next training session. The other concept that we're going to talk about a little more on day 3 is the recovery concept in that following week 3 or week 4, where you undulate the training in reverse. So there's a wavy pattern in terms of the amount of intensity and the time that you're going to be doing it, where you bring it down so the body has a chance to recover. We'll talk a little bit more about recovery on day 3, and this has been High Performance Training to Intensity.